Okay, so I would like to begin with a, if you like, a global question. But since the certification of properties in the Baltic states and the popularity of BREEAM and LEED is just becoming popular, basically. Only first buildings are being certified now, and this is still very new in the market. So the question is, I think we mentioned that during the conference today, but how would you summarize, what actual benefits can sustainable development bring to business, environment, and societies? And I would like to, Martin, since you talked a very long time ago, so if you could.
It does feel a long time ago, but I mean, yeah. Is that better?
I'll give you that.
So it does feel a long time ago since we started the conference, but what a great conference we've had here today. So to answer your direct question, I think it's been covered well by lots of the speakers that when we look at sustainability, I actually think the word sustainability actually doesn't help us in this conversation. I think you need to unwrap it the next layer down, and you need to actually ask yourself about the social benefits, the economic benefits, and the environmental benefits. And then when, I think Hadley did this really well, when you start to add those together, you can actually start to see the business case forming for you. So you can start to say, do I really want a building that is going to be better for my staff? If I'm building an office building that is a great environment to work and live, that has a value. That's something I can quantify. If I can demonstrate as a corporate that actually I'm reducing my carbon emissions, if I can demonstrate to my tenants that I've got a lower energy bill, if I can create a vibrant community, when you start to add together all those ingredients, the business case actually is really, really simple. And as you start to get more and more buildings coming through the country, what you start to see is the skills level go up. You start to see the supply chains reacting to the market, being able to provide those products and services at a better price and more competitive price. So you're the start of the conversation. And I can tell you now that process, that pace of changes can happen more. But I actually think the word sustainability sometimes puts people off because it gives people the feeling it's about a green agenda. And the reality is it's about what's the right thing to do in terms of driving change for people, communities, and also the environment as well.
Lydia, do you think you could add something?
I'm not sure I can necessarily add apart from just nod. I agree with that.
I'd like to add something. Ivaldis, I really appreciated the profiling and characteristic and agree completely with the idea of a regional and nationally based system. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention there's and I'm thrilled also that you are intending to add existing building stock to this paradigm, because I think that's critical, especially in a city that I embryonically know only on a drive from the airport, but am struck by how much the existing building stock is sitting waiting for attention, and it needs, the developing community needs guidance on how to do this, so leaving that off seems to be something of urgency for you to build upon what you're doing. But I also have to say that the lack of the focus on the cultural and the aesthetic. I know it's a more difficult subject, but you can imagine in my talk, I was making a case for these factors in it. The sustainability movement in America has grown a bit, quite a bit, and you can see it in the fracturing and deepening of the new systems, the building future systems, adding beauty into the mix and arguing that that we need to fall in love with our buildings for them to have real resonance, durability, sustainability. We have to crack this nut. And if we only think of ourselves addressing these issues in performance or in energy or waste terms, we're going to miss the mark of an important mark of bringing along the whole society with us. Because like it or not, humans attach themselves to buildings emotionally like we do to each other. And until we recognize that these emotional factors are identifiable, bring cultural anthropologists to the table with your group of experts and ask questions about how buildings do establish their meaning and how can we enjoin the work we're doing on the sustainability front with the cultural factors of deeper meaning. We'll build greater cities, greater buildings, we'll have happier people, and so I think you ought to go after that as part of it and distinguish even your own national aspirations along that line to show others that this does mean something to this society.
You're making a strong case to put your studio here, aren't you?
Yeah, I think more and more arguments for that. Yeah, but so all in all, it seems that it's still a long way to go. But I guess Baltics are headed in the right direction, at least. I mean, if you're not, so I think it's hard for us to see from the inside. But when somebody comes out from the outside and sees in a more critical way, it's good.
But I think one thing that really struck me today, and you did it so eloquently, is that the one thing that is really very evident in this room about all the conversation today is passion.
Yes.
Mm.
And what you've got to try and do is make sure you don't lose that passion about buildings. And it's about how do we make sure that we create buildings which are great places to work and live. And sometimes when you look at world cities, we're creating boxes. They're not great places to work and live. They are dysfunctional spaces which have a good real estate return. But actually it's much more than that. And I think you've done it very eloquently in terms of creating that cultural identity and making sure that we create rating tools that really drive that process forward.
Okay. No, I agree. You touched a little bit upon the social responsibility of corporates. And I'd like to speak a little bit about the partnerships that exist amongst the owners and the developers of space with the actual users of the space. Could you, identify some of initiatives that actually are existent and that are functional in terms of this communication?
I think I can talk a bit to that with the work that we're doing at King's Cross. Those occupiers that are coming to the development were almost self-chosen, really, that they want to be part of a community and an area of London that's really becoming an exciting place to be. But what it does mean is that we have a real opportunity to bring those businesses together, and we have a forum that meets with the occupiers. They don't have to come, but a lot of them are interested in coming to hear about how each other is working and their environmental practices within the business. But we've also got that to include corporate social responsibility as well, and the community activities that each of the businesses can get involved in. One example is that as Argent, we're piloting a scheme with the new school where every 2 weeks, I personally as well now, go and read with a 4-year-old to get them excited about reading. We're piloting it, and then it will be an opportunity for each of the occupiers to have a term a year to go to the school and engage with the children. We've also been working closely with Waitrose, who are an occupier as well, and they're going to be working with the school to provide both the fruit and vegetables that don't get purchased. They go to the school, they're still edible, and they get cooked up in the canteen for the school kids' food. So it's trying to find those links between the facilities and the community activities that are happening on site and the occupiers that are there. And actually today is, I've just had an email through, we've officially launched our King's Cross website that enables anyone, in fact visitors, occupiers, we're mainly aiming at occupiers, where they can see all of the volunteering projects that they can get involved in the King's Cross area. So we've been negotiating and discussing with the community projects to upload their programs and opportunities, but now it's about communicating it to the tenants as well. So it's really linking in, you're coming to work here, but you can also come and be part of that community.
I think the work you're doing in King's Cross is so spectacular. And just the anecdotes you added about reaching out to the educational and awakening process of the youth in the same setting within which you're doing all this other important higher plane work, it did make me think. And again, I'm thinking that I'm invited here to prod you onward and forward in what you're doing, affirming what you're doing, but saying the bar keeps rising. And another category of buildings I want you to add to this is educational cultural buildings. And the reason is, at least in America, and I think it exists somewhere around the world, these buildings have a social responsibility. They're given social privileges and economic privileges in the society as nonprofits. They have a greater responsibility to these issues of helping all of us understand the importance of these issues. So they should be most embodied by these factors.
But I think what's a really clever trick, and we've done this in the UK with some of our educational buildings, you actually make the buildings part of the learning experience. So what we've done is, you kind of put in calculations into the buildings which the various school kids can use as part of their standard school curriculum. You actually make sure that the facilities in that building, in that school, help them to understand about ecology and nature. So then you need to create great buildings which are functional in terms of adaptable living spaces, but the buildings themselves are actually part of the school curriculum.
They are tools of educating.
So, and I think that's the thing that sometimes we miss, that part of the process of change is about educating people why you need to change the process. And if you start to talk to people worldwide about why is water important, some people say, well, it's not important. But actually, if you start to understand about water scarcity and you start to educate people, people actually change their behaviour more than they think they can. And so that process of change starts with individuals about making sure they actually do the best they can. And then you work up to the building, the community, and the neighbourhood, and the city. So there's a lot that can be done.
Okay. So when those young people grow up and they go to office space, you mentioned that in King's Cross the majority of space is actually offices, right?
So 54%.
Do you have initiatives like green leases or some kind of clauses in the agreements that are signed for 10, 15, 20 years with the occupiers, just to be on the same track of saving energy, promoting sustainability as such?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, we have clauses within the leases as opposed to specific green leases, but it's very much about the commitment to share data, and I think that's the very first stage. And with the environment forum that we've set up, we're in a position now where we can actually benchmark the occupiers against each other anonymously to start with, but my plan is to make it more available, to actually start for occupiers to understand whether their floors are using more energy or less energy than others, so they can start to ask why and actually think about, well, how are their employees using this space? What are the opportunities to both manage costs but also utilise the space effectively? Does it need to all be cornered off into meeting rooms or offices? Actually, does an open plan add to that productivity? And those are the things that can be considered once you have the data. And the key piece with BREEAM and LEED is the metering, and you can't manage what you don't monitor and I think and measure, and that's a really important piece. But interestingly, we don't have anything in our leases that they have to engage with the community. That's something that's just coming through naturally.
It's not an obligation, it's more of an initiative.
It's more
from both parties.
But I think that's an important point there, actually, that when it comes to this conversation between the landlord and tenant, there has to be, and it's almost using your language here, there has to be this support and challenge process that the landlord is playing their part in terms of providing a service, but are they doing the best they possibly can? And I've been involved in a number of developments where the tenant, because of their credentials, are really pushing the envelope. And it's the landlord that's actually slowing down the performance by the shared services they're providing to the individual tenants. And it's actually quite healthy when you start to get a conversation where, sometimes the landlord's pulling the tenant, and sometimes the tenant is pushing the landlord. By getting more transparent data, and we look to where we're going worldwide in terms of big data and sort of the Internet of Things, we are going to get more freedom of information to share among people. We need to use that in a constructive way to actually raise the performance, to raise that transparency to people to understand how they can improve.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing.
Right.
Just that when I talk about King's Cross, I think it can come across as, oh, everything's perfect and wonderful, and it just, ta-da, we have all the information. But we don't. It's taken a long time, really, to get to this point of both building up the relationships with the occupiers in the Environment and CSR Forum, and also with the building managers and the teams that are working with the buildings, to ensure that we've got all of the correct information from the meters. Are the meters working correctly? Have they been calibrated and commissioned in the right way? And we're really taking lessons from our first buildings to move them onto our next buildings, where we have specific specifications about what meters need to go in and the systems that work correctly in the processes for commissioning. Because however closely you manage it, there's always lessons to be learned. So it's not all easy. There's a lot of work that goes behind pulling together this information. So it's hopefully, I don't know whether that makes it easier or not to tell you that, but it's a learning process. I hope that.
It is a learning process, and yeah, sometimes we are learning while doing here. It's the way it works.
Yeah.
Pietro, are there any initiatives related to this partnership between landlords and occupiers that Skagi is bringing over from Norway, or you're planning to do in Quadrum?
Well, sitting here, I'm thinking that there's a lot to learn, listening to these other participants here. Obviously, what we will do is we will create an open platform where all the information will be available for all the users, with all the information, what's going on, and it's going to be an interactive platform. Is it going to be Facebook or something else? Most probably, or there will be a Facebook page, obviously, but maybe another platform is even more useful. We kind of have to see and learn. And thinking about what we can contribute to the society, we still, there is not much cooperation in this way. Obviously, we're doing already this, participating in this spring cleaning with Quadrum, and once it gets up and running, we will invite everybody to participate in this. We will have a kindergarten in the project, but we haven't really thought about having anything cooperation with them, but that's a great idea. We have made an art competition, so we are putting in 5 installations by different Lithuanian artists. So this will be obviously open for neighbors and the community as such to come and to experience and to touch and see. So I think we are learning too. It's really interesting to sit here and hear what you guys are saying.
I think we'll have, myself as well, I'll have a lot of takeouts from this conference, so I'm happy about that. Martin, are there any schemes of BREEAM for occupiers of space? I mean, for instance, if the building is not certified, can an occupier who is willing to get into a certified building, but he still has lease for 8 years, can he certify only the space he's occupying?
You can indeed, yeah. So we use BREEAM in use, which is buildings in use, and that's about collecting data and understanding buildings' performance. You can either do it as a tenant, or you can work with your landlord to do that assessment. Part of it is looking at the manager of the building. Part of it's looking at sort of the operational elements. So you can actually do a relatively simple assessment of an existing building. And what a lot of people are doing, I think it picks up what you're doing here in terms of your own system. It's about sometimes people actually use the assessment and don't certify it. They use it to understand where the building is letting themselves down. And then they will go back, and over a period of years or months, they will actually then improve their building and then certify. And I think that's the trick sometimes, isn't it? That you don't want to be told what you already know, that your building isn't that good. What you want to be given is information about what you can do to improve it. And then once you've improved it, you can actually then publicise it, and you can promote the fact that you've actually improved by X percentage. And I think that's the thing about rating tools and certification. It is what you want it to be. It can be a guide, it can be a formal process, but it's about driving change. It's about trying to share that best practice to help people get to somewhere better than they were before.
Good point. Shall we get back to this issue that we have in the capitals of Baltic states. I don't know if you noticed, but the cities are very much car dominated, and the public transport is not popular at all. Bikes are increasing in popularity, but still, I mean, we have winter and nobody wants to drive in winter, differently than in Scandinavia. But the question is it possible at all to emphasize or maintain the sustainability mindset in such a car-dominated cities? And actually, can buildings, or making buildings better, can influence the people's approach to accessibility and to transport and to just moving around the town?
Well, I think, I can't remember who mentioned it, but the one thing I find fascinating is on our requirement for cycle racks and showers in buildings. It's one of the criteria we have. And the number of times I must have been challenged on why we do it. But let me kind of counter that by telling you a couple of stories. So a couple of buildings put in cycle racks and showers and said, I don't know why we're doing it, but we were trying to get the credit. I went back to that building 2 years later, and the managing director of the building came up to me and said, we were wrong, because we had showers and cycle racks. We didn't think we were going to use it. We've had to build more showers and more cycle racks, because now we have the facilities. It's changed our staff's behaviour. They now cycle to work. They enjoy cycling. We've had to build a cycle way up to the building to allow people to actually do it safely. And actually what it's done is made the staff happier, it's made them more, it's made them fitter. And I think it comes back to that point. When we actually look to try and actually influence design, and we add some of these criteria, some people think we're just doing it just to make their life difficult. We're doing it because we know that is best practice. And actually, it changes. It takes time to change sometimes. But actually, if you do actually embrace some of the things we're trying to drive people and change behaviour, you can actually see the benefits.
Was that building in the UK?
It was. There are also buildings in Sweden and Norway where we've had exactly the same amount of feedback. And it's about understanding how you can just get people to think about different transport options.
It's not about the climate.
Sometimes it is. In the scheme in the Middle East, we deleted the cycle credits for obvious reasons. It's just a little bit too hot to cycle. But if you actually are reasonable in terms of what you're asking for, and you're demonstrating that it's a practical, viable solution, then actually, quite often it does happen.
I think that we have the same experience from Norway, and you're commenting many times about the weather in Lithuania. It makes it impossible to use a bicycle, and this is one of the, let's say, arguments against passing over from a car to a bicycle. Every Lithuanian loves their car, and you're going to take him out of the car. It's just not possible. So how are we going to do that? So the first thing, you have to make it really comfortable to take a bike. And once you have seen it, I don't know, we will probably create tours down to our parking, bicycle parking, to show them that here is actually, the lockers, and here's a shower, it's clean and nice here, you can come, it's safe, nobody will say that you're strange. So, you really have to start from the really, really small, and once they get into it, they really like it, they get fit, they don't have to go to the gym, and even in winter, believe it or not, there is people that are that crazy that go with a bicycle every day in Oslo, and you have more snow in Oslo than you have in Vilnius. It's colder in Oslo, but they still do. And the same problem, like you mentioned, there was built, I think, 200 lockers in this one building I'm thinking of, and now they have 450. Because nobody believed that more than 200 people would do it, but now it's actually 450. It's really, really good.
The closest we've come to Norway in the U.S. is Minnesota. And
which is hardly, let's say, it's overpopulated by Norwegians.
and others in the Navy, but yes, but if I was to ask you what the most popular city in America is for bike riding, how many of you would have thought Minneapolis? In fact, it is. And like the Netherlands, something happens to people when the seasons that invite you to use your bicycle energize myriads of people, and the celebration of using bicycles. I would have never thought 10 years ago that this would have happened. I thought it was crazy on campus when the new young freshmen wore shorts all winter long. And then it turned into our generation is going to claim some values and some ethical and even aesthetic ideas. And we're going to prove those who we've inherited our cities from wrong. And this is what's happening in Minnesota. It's an absolutely incredible process that's taking place. The bike rental thing where you swipe your credit card, they're all over the city now. And so I want to use that to underscore that sometimes the triggering of ideas have this cascading effect because there is a desire when people start thinking and reflecting on what their habits are, that they actually joyfully change them. But it usually happens between generations. And this is where the promise of your growing, emerging generation that's empowering itself through an evolution of the culture is something you should seize and understand the importance of what you can trigger here. You know, there was one anecdote I wanted to position in this, which has to do with this idea that buildings really are living bodies, and they have all of the same characteristics that we have. They have circulation systems, they have, you know, heating, cooling systems, but they have emotions, and they have dimensions that we can actually value as we get deeper and deeper into the feedback that we're asking of building owners. And this is where I think there's a great richness that lies just ahead of us, that after we finally master the metrics and we get clear about good feedback, we're going to be hungrier for more feedback, and that feedback is going to bring a revolution in the building industry that I think is really exciting. You had on the last slide, or a bunch of us had the last slides, you know, let's look forward to the future. I really think that's where the frontier is going, that we're starting to understand that buildings and landscapes and cities have so much to tell us, and we just haven't been paying attention to them. And the more we pay attention to them, the more feedback we court from them, the more investment we make to make them healthier, better, richer, the more satisfied we're going to be. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
I think an interesting one just to kind of throw into the conversation is, I think I mentioned a couple of people, in London there's Canary Wharf, and they're starting to talk about the expansion of Canary Wharf. So we were having conversations with them about, so what can you do better based on your experience of that last set of sort of, you know, buildings, and that got them to start to think about, so when this building is completed, you know, the next sort of, you know, 5-10 years, and it's got a 50-year life expectancy, what's the technology which will exist then that we need to design to that building? And so as a consequence of that conversation, they started to build in platforms on the roofs of the building for drones, because their vision is that some of the goods and services will be delivered by drones to the building, not by our traditional methods in terms of by street delivery. And that gets you started to think, when you start to think about the buildings we're building today, how do we need to make sure that how adaptable they are, how they can actually change to actually make sure that technology can be inserted, it really becomes quite exciting.
Yes. Well, coming back to the bicycles, basically, I have seen some people riding bikes in winter in January or February, but they were in the region. I found out that. Yes, I checked. But I agree that it all comes down to making the infrastructure in the buildings actually work or accessible for occupiers of space. And I think it's also very important about having the leadership or people actually encouraging, you know, to think differently and to use different means of transport. And the person that was riding the bike in January in snow, it was the CEO of one very big enterprise in Lithuania. So I think that's a very good example of, you know, the mindset change that we are seeing here.
I saw a very interesting picture on one of the internet news channels. It was the Swedish ambassadors with her main colleagues. They went to the foreign ministry and they all came by bicycles. It was really cool.
I saw that.
And unsurprisingly, all of the partners at Argent ride Bromptons around between meetings. That's the way they travel. But one thing I just wanted to add, car to bike is quite big transition. And I think there's a real opportunity, particularly with buildings that are being built at the moment and the networks that you're going to be creating, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or any of the building systems, is actually the opportunity around car sharing, getting people to think about it doesn't have to be just them in their car doing the journey. There's opportunities for connection and networking, and actually that's I'm sorry, I can't remember who mentioned around the travel agency that's done incredibly well, being based in the Navigator building, isn't it? And actually, there's so many more opportunities that come from getting people together, and those 45-minute, hour-long car journeys can actually really develop amazing work contacts, as well as it being a travel and money-saving and a time-saving piece. So it's just thinking about those opportunities for connecting people in the business to actually reduce the use of those car spaces down to fewer. And then there's also, down to 2, and then there's also the opportunity for all those car spaces eventually to be turned into cycle spaces. So that's, you've got the space for a lot of cycle spaces in there for later on.
I don't know if it's applicable in King's Cross, but would you agree that making a transport plan also to encourage people to use alternatives and basically just to make them familiar with the alternatives that exist? Because people tend to just, not to switch how they do it oftenly. I mean, just not to go out from the car to the public transport. But otherwise, if you provide them with alternatives and you identify what are the alternatives, so I think it's also a step forwards. We heard today a lot about redeveloping or making old new again, or making old green. What would be your thoughts about the perfect match, if you like, about old and new in the project? If there's an opportunity, I mean, should you maintain the old buildings and refurb them, or just demolish and build new? What would be the ideal perfect match, if you like, if it's possible to identify that?
That's like a softball for me, isn't it? Underhanded law. I think, first of all, I think we would all agree that the circumstances are everything, and most all situations need a deep dive of assessment and imagination to figure out what that right balance is. But I think more important than the nobility of saving buildings has to do with what we find in them when we examine them yet again. I think you could see that in some of the experiences I've had. Or what new imagination could be projected on an older building and therefore altered into the future. And I can't help but think of the great cities of the world, how many times that was done, where a building was originally something, it became something else through somebody else's imagination. There were traces of the old and aspects of the new, and yet again it happened. If you wanted to take regeneration, more fully, it would be in this process of bettering a building by having more creative eyes and more complex understandings and interpretations knit into it. And that's the opportunity, I think, here that the DNA of sustainability is holding for us, waiting for us to get there finally. It's not just that, the quip that, an existing building is automatically the greenest building. It is, in fact, what an existing building holds as a possibility for being interpreted anew or reawakened and becoming something else. It's the hope, religion, this is really going to go off the wall, so get ready. What the hope we have is that we are somewheres, live forever or reborn, right? This is like a fantasy humans have, right? But we can actually do this for buildings. When we regenerate them, we give them another life. And isn't this some fundamental human interest we have in ourselves and in each other in a way?
But I think there's something more than that, isn't it? Because I think that's right. We always need to, if you think about the embodied energy that's going into a building, actually just to knock it down, you're losing lots of that energy to start with. But if you get to the point where you can't actually reuse that building, you can actually reuse components of it. You can actually take some of the materials and reuse that in another building. And it's an interesting policy decision that's been made in the Netherlands that you cannot build a new building unless you pair it with an existing building that's being demolished. And actually, a percentage of that existing building that's being demolished has to be used in the new building. So it's about understanding that actually, we do have a certain amount of materials already in the supply chain. How do we more effectively use that? And actually, as you say, if you look at some of those materials, they're beautiful. Because they've been aged, they've actually got a great sort of character to them. Bring them into a new building actually adds more character straight away, even though you might have a new sort of template you're actually building from. But so if you're not actually reusing the building and actually refurbishing it, there are other smart policy decisions you can bring in, which actually sort of minimises that impact.
There was one building which was on one of the slides of one of the participants earlier. There's a project in Oslo that I've been following quite, it's very interesting. It's an old building, they stripped it down, they kept all the concrete structure, they took the old windows, cut them off, they reused them for dividing walls inside, they put it on new facades and so forth. And as she mentioned, it's a 60-year process. They have to prove during 60 years that they have a positive energy, or that actually it uses less energy than it creates. I think that's really amazing. And if you can take a building which is already standing there, and you don't actually have to dig or put use new concrete, and it's a lot of energy that goes into that part of the process. So if you can reuse those buildings which are usable or fit for that, I think that's a really green. I really love that idea.
I think also, even if it's sometimes just a trace that is retained and used almost anecdotally, that has an incredible power. It's like respecting an ancestor or an attribute of an ancestor that you most found intriguing. And this is really important that we not just think of buildings as fully functional, but as a collection of an amalgamation of elements and ideas, and that the regenerative process has the opportunity to interpret and edit and distill and engage that in a powerful way. And
I think our conversation over coffee was the point of it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's your conversation. The conversation we had over coffee, we're getting absorbed in this. It's part of the texture, it's part of the history of the landscape in a town, isn't it? And actually, if you look at some cities who are demolishing the whole sort of cityscape, they're losing their history. And actually, what it does to people as they sort of grow up, you can see the history of a town. You can see how it's evolved over time. You can see the different use of materials. You can see the different use of architecture. And that makes a really rich sort of community. It creates a culture. It creates an understanding of actually what you're building from.
Okay, thank you. To sum it up, what would be the essential points to consider or actions to take for such a small region as Baltic states? We are still an emerging, economically wise countries, and the sustainable development is only becoming popular, as we just discussed. So what would be the actions to take if we want to play in the same league with the all major markets like Germany, Scandinavia, the UK? What would be your recommendations to push sustainable development?
Yeah, what a big question. I think it's about being passionate. It comes back to the first comment I made that it's very easy when everybody walks away from today. Everybody, I'm hoping, is going to be inspired about what the GPC is doing and about what the speakers have talked about. But it's about taking that passion back to the office and actually doing something tomorrow, next week, next month they weren't going to do before. It's very easy in our corporate environments and in our design offices and our engineering offices to actually comply and actually do things that we've always done. if everybody here today went away and did something better than they were going to do before they came to this conference, that will be a massive step forward.
I think it's my recommendation is there's so much out there, and the wheel has already been invented. Don't keep trying to reinvent the wheel. Use the examples that you've got from the Build Upon. Sounded like a fantastic initiative to be able to understand what's happening already in the region that can be relevant and very easily or considered to be incorporated into Lithuania. So I think that would be my real point. Don't reinvent the wheel, but tweak it to what will work for you all.
In the spirit of that, I think another recommendation I would have is build upon proudly and innovatively on top of everything that has been done. Actually, this is kind of really important, that if you really want to distinguish yourself, don't think about catching up, think about leaping forward. What is it that Lithuania and, let's say, whatever the idiosyncratic history of the making of this nation gave you? What is it that's in that is most distinguished that you could build upon? We were talking the other night about water, over dinner, the significance of water. You know, that's a whole category itself. But I think, and you know, this isn't uncommon, but the sense of embarrassment about these Soviet buildings that are lingering is an incredible asset. And I've said this before, but I just think there's things here that rarely exist in other places, and you should think creatively about that and affirm your culture and your enterprise together to distinguish what you're going to do that builds upon what everyone else has done. That will get you much further ahead.
Believe me, you haven't seen much yet.
I thought we were the same league. So, I think that Lithuania, well, all the Baltic countries, but I know Lithuania better, has an incredible asset in all its people. Very high level of education, very smart people. They're very willing to work. And I think that this change which is going, I think is going to happen quicker here than other places. And I do believe and I agree that these terrible buildings from the Soviet time, they are a real asset in the sense that we are so far behind the rest of Europe, energy-wise or sustainability. So by improving these buildings, we will catch up so much. So it's really a big thing to do. Of course, it has to be evaluated if they have any value, if they are structurally solid, if they can stand, because there is no point in investing money to keep them, let's say, low energy and efficient if they will fall down after 7 years. So that's my only question. But I would formulate the question differently. You know, we are in our league, and it's not any worse than the rest of Europe.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. I mean, we are using the same, say, quadrum as your project. I think it would be, positioned the way it is in Vilnius. It would be positioned the same in London or Amsterdam or in whatever, Western European capital city.
So this is what's good about any certification system, BREEAM or LEED.
Yes.
It's the same all over. And anybody who knows the certification system knows that it's the same if it's in any of those cities you mentioned or in Vilnius.
Okay, so I think we're heading the right direction, and I hope that we'll be seeing you, maybe not next year, but in a couple of years' time. And you
Why not next year?
next year, and then in future.